The year is 1997. After a somewhat hectic development cycle with Quake 1, John Romero left over creative differences. Now, without Romero, the id Software team must move on, and they decided to make a sequel to Quake. This sequel, known simply as Quake 2, released just under a year and a half later after Quake 1. The question is, how does it hold up? Quake 2's gameplay is perhaps more straightforward compared to Quake's. You won't find any mystical portals in other worlds, or mythical elements of any kind, really. Instead, it's more high-tech orientated like Doom, except replace the hell with more of a Star Trek Borg kind of enemy. That's more or less what you'll be facing, as this properly introduces the Strogg into the fold. That's not to say there isn't variety, mind you. You've got basic pistol grunts, of course, gotta have a hapless mook in there somewhere. Of course, after you down one, you may notice that they can sometimes shoot at you even when they're down for the count, and you can also give them when they're dead. Thankfully, enemies usually make a distinct death sound when they're really dead, so keep shooting until you hear it. There's also machine gun variants that go down just as fast, but obviously cut through you much quicker and are a much greater threat. Next up is the Enforcer, where the game stops screwing around. He's armed with a chain gun and can keep attacking even when his head is popped off, making headshots no guarantee. Now thankfully the Super Shotgun is effective at taking them out pretty close up. Then you've got Parasites, clearly inspired by the dogs from Quake, except those annoying little things latch their tongues out to leech at you. Especially annoying is the Flyers. They're like lost souls, but they fire shots at you rather than charge you. One enemy that can be annoying in a completely different way is the Gunner. They're armed with a machine gun and a grenade launcher, so take them out fast. And then there's the Berserker. They're fast, but they're melee only, so they're basically like the Peakies from Doom. They can be a real hassle when they're in a group with other enemies, but they're pretty easy to take down if you can isolate them. Gladiators are kind of like the Spider Mastermind in that you want to peek around corners when dealing with them because they're armed with a friggin' railgun. Funny thing is that in comparison, I don't really find tanks to be all that threatening. Granted, they can be pretty damaging if you just completely screw around, but they move very slowly and are big targets. Just keep peppering until they're dead and move around a little to avoid their shots. Now, technicians are basically flying robots with rapid blaster weapons, but they're not that big of a problem. Likewise, Icarus are functionally just cacodemons, so move and shoot. If you think you're safe in the water, you'd better think again because there are Barracuda sharks, but they only have melee. They're like the fish from Quake 1. Iron Maidens are like Revenants, only much less annoying because their rockets aren't homing. Just don't take them too lightly because their rockets can still hurt. Brains are pretty non-threatening, but they have shields to absorb damage with. One useful trick I've noticed is to throw grenades slightly behind them, since their shield, from what I've read, doesn't work in the back. That works just fine for me since I rarely use hand-tossed grenades for anything else. There are even medic enemies that are capable of reviving enemies that haven't been gibleted, so make sure you either giblet every corpse in the area or more easily just kill the medic really fast. As you can plainly see, Quake 2 has a variety of enemies for different situations, and that's not even getting into the major boss enemies. Now thankfully you do have your own arsenal to deal with here. In terms of your arsenal choices, it's pretty similar to Doom. You've got a pistol, shotgun, super shotgun, machine gun, rocket launcher, hyper blaster, and BFG. However, there are some variants. The pistol is infinite but fires a projectile, same type that would be used for the Doom 2016 pistol later on. It can be easy to take that for granted now, but it's nice to have your fallback weapon still be a ranged weapon, since apart from the Doom chainsaw in some select circumstances, melee weapons in these games tend to suck to have to rely on. As mentioned before, you can also get hand-tossed grenades in addition to a grenade launcher, essentially making the hand grenades redundant for the most part, aside from the brain enemies I mentioned before. Of course, then you've got the chain gun. It's a nice upgrade over the machine gun, but if you've got it fully revved, it can take a little while for it to stop firing. Naturally, I've saved the best for last, the most iconic weapon in Quake 2. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, I am talking about the railgun! It may suck really hard to have to do battle with gladiators armed with them, but once you get your own, it's go time! For those of you not in the know, the railgun is basically a laser sniper round, just without the scope.
It pierces enemies and does a whole lot of damage. It may take some skill and precision to use, so naturally I miss my shots about half the time, but the weapon feels meaty enough and every successful hit is like a rush of euphoria.
Kinda makes the BFG weapon seem anemic in comparison, even if it is a crowd killer like the Doom BFG is. One handy little upgrade over Quake 1 is that it takes the Duke 3D style for power-ups, where they store themselves in your inventory until you actually need them. Some might actually see this as a little game-breaking, since even the invulnerability and quad damage can be stored up. When I got to the final boss, I realized I had an invulnerability I didn't use and proceeded to curb stomp him with rockets. Hey, if nothing else, it felt really good after going through the first half of the fight the hard way. Quake 2 does take a somewhat different style than previous id Software shooters in that the story is given slightly more emphasis here. You get minor cutscenes from here and there and mission objectives, although it still feels very much like a classic FPS. There's also a hub system where you can return to previous areas and it remembers everything you did in them. This was apparently a feature intended for Doom, but it was scrapped due to hardware limitations, but I guess it only took 4 years for tech to catch up with their ambitions. All in all, the gameplay is very fun to play. If nothing else, Carmack definitely excels at programming new game engines, and the good old shooting action has been retained in full. While your actions are contextualized more than Quake 1 or Doom, it's ultimately the same as hitting switches and finding door keys. On that front, Quake 2 does excel if you appreciate classic shooters with relatively open environments, full weapon inventory, static health, and the speed of a cheetah doped up on Red Bull. Okay, now plot is where Quake 2 really starts to show its weaker aspects in my opinion. It seems John Romero was the primary factor in Doom and Quake 1 having more fantastic mythical elements such as the demons of hell or the portals into the netherworlds. The Strogg are significantly less interesting in comparison, even compared to the Borg, which they clearly took inspiration from since they more or less assimilate people into their ranks. It stars a marine named Bitterman who must invade the Strogg's homeworld, known very creatively as Strogos. All the while, he must establish a communications link, take out the planetary defenses, disable the interplanetary gateway, and then finally take out their commander. Unfortunately, you're not really required to care about the story whatsoever. All you really have to know to succeed is that you have your orders and you have to carry them out one by one, so a lot of running and gunning for the good of humanity and all that other crap, and occasionally backtracking. I guess Carmack's really living up to his motto that stories in video games are expected but not that important. Personally, I prefer Quake 4's approach a bit better in that regard, especially since you actually see the Stroggification process firsthand, but this is a 90s shooter. I'm sure the Strogg were just meant to be a means to a shooting in at the time. Ultimately, the bulk of the story is told in your objectives, which you're free to ignore, which I appreciate. It is nice to have a story in a format that's optional rather than force-fed down your throat, especially if you want replay value. In that regard, it gets the job done and doesn't get in the way, so thumbs up for that, I guess. Quake 2 definitely isn't going to look too pretty nowadays, but it's still a well enough upgrade over Quake 1. Most notably is that there's bone animations, so animations are smoother. It also lacks the strange, almost pulsating flesh effect the original Quake had, presumably due to inaccurate vertex textures, and it kind of reminds me of what you typically saw on the PS1. In contrast to the mostly brownish Quake, Quake 2 exhibits a very strong tone of orange throughout the general experience, especially outside. That could probably be justified by the reddish sky, but some more color variety is always nice. Of course, there's always the option of graphical enhancers if you don't want to play vanilla, and that is the perk of id Tech 2 being open sourced. While Quake 2 technically has a software mode, I think it's the last id Software game to have one. I'd advise against it because it definitely looks compromised, and odds are good that the game wasn't made with it in mind like Quake 1 appeared to be. That should be a non-issue in this day and age. You'd basically have to have hardware support for Quake 2 to be able to watch this video smoothly in 720p. To Quake 2's credit, the prison areas are actually fairly disturbing. You can see your own men who've basically been tortured, and I'm fairly certain they'll never be able to live their own lives after this. You can get ammo by offing them, but I never really saw it as just sacrificing them to get ammo. I saw it as putting them out of their misery. Their voice lines suggest they're in a great amount of pain, and one of them selected at random even tells you to kill them. Quake 1 and Doom may have had twitching corpses, but that is definitely a whole nother level of morbid. Now, if you happen to be one of the lucky few blessed to have an RTX card, there's a recent release that has glorious ray tracing. For us regular plebs, though, there's always Quake 2 XP, which is nothing to snuff at either. It may not have all those fancy ray tracing, but it still has plenty of nice lighting and shader effects. The biggest shortcoming I've noticed on Quake 2 XP is screen space reflections being cold if it's not on screen, which isn't really a big deal. As for music, Quake 2 carries over the proud id shooter tradition of having a very metal soundtrack, in addition to some nice ambience here and there. I'll admit, it's really nice hearing the big meaty ships flying overhead, and even better if you can actually see them flying overhead in the sky. In general, it's pretty cool being able to see and hear little environmental touches like that, and it makes the world seem a little bit alive. While the Strogg look a little bit generic, at least they follow the recognizable silhouette rule. Pretty much from a glance, you can tell which enemy's which, except maybe for the machine gun grunts from the blaster ones that might have been intentional. Each enemy is very noticeably distinguishable, both visually and audibly. Encounter a few of them and you'll instantly know exactly what's gunning for you, which is always appreciated in shooters like this. Overall, Quake 2's presentation is fine enough. Well, it would have been nice to see a little bit more creativity and especially color variety, but at least they're nicely varied and for the time there's a good amount of detail everywhere. I know I can be a little harsh on the game because it feels generic compared to Quake 1 and Doom, but it really is a marvel for its time and it can stand on its own. Quake 2 is a very interesting little game overall to say the least, and it's definitely a mixed bag with how I feel about it. On the one hand, this is the post-Romero era and you can tell his creative energy is very much gone here. It feels a little cut by the numbers compared to Quake 1 and Doom, but at the same time, it's still a fun classic shooter to play through. Ultimately, it all boils down to what you want in your classic shooters. If you don't mind that the presentation and plot are a little on the dull and predictable side, there's still a lot of fun to be had here, especially once the game gives you a railgun to finally play around with. I recommend trying it out for that reason, and especially give it a try if you have an RTX card just to appreciate the ray tracing effects. Even if you don't though, Quake 2 XP is a very solid alternative as well. Quake 2 may be a generic shooter, but it's still a very fun one to say the least. This has been my review of Quake 2. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.